By the late 1800s, the island of Cuba had reached a breaking point.
For centuries, it had lived under Spanish colonial rule, a rule marked by heavy taxes, strict military control, and political repression.
Cuban farmers, workers, and intellectuals felt the weight of an empire that had long since lost its influence.
The desire for independence burned across the island, fueled by economic hardship, nationalist writings, and
Cuba was ready for change, but Spain was determined to maintain control.
The situation grew explosive in the 1890s. Cuban rebels, known as Mambuses, launched a major uprising that spread across the countryside. They burned plantations to weaken the colonial economy and fought Spanish troops in guerrilla-style battles. Spain responded with brutal force. Civilians were forced into concentration camps under a policy called reconcentración, where tens of thousands died from hunger and disease. Reports of these atrocities shocked the world and fueled sympathy for the Cuban independence movement. Across the ocean, the United States watched the situation closely. American businesses had large investments in Cuba, especially in sugar plantations. Newspapers in the U.S., driven by sensational headlines, published dramatic stories about Spanish cruelty. Public opinion shifted sharply against Spain. The idea of helping Cuba win its freedom gained political momentum, especially among American leaders who believed the U.S. should play a greater role on the world stage. Everything changed on February 15, 1898. The U.S. battleship USS Maine, docked in Havana Harbor to protect American interests, suddenly exploded. More than 250 American sailors were killed. The cause of the explosion remains debated, but at the time, American newspapers blamed Spain immediately. The slogan, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," swept across the United States. Within months, the two nations were at war. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, but changed the future of Cuba forever. The U.S. Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet in both the Philippines and Cuba. American and Cuban forces cooperated on the battlefield, capturing key positions such as San Juan Hill and Santiago de Cuba. The conflict was short, deadly, and decisive. Spain, weakened and overwhelmed, had no choice but to surrender. In December 1898, the Treaty of Paris officially ended Spanish rule in Cuba. After more than 400 years of colonial domination, Spain's presence on the island was finished. But independence did not come immediately. Instead of transferring power directly to the Cuban people, the treaty handed control of the island to the United States. For many Cubans who had fought and sacrificed for their own freedom, this moment was bittersweet a victory, overshadowed by uncertainty. As Spanish officials departed the island, confusion and hope filled the air. Some Cubans celebrated the end of Spanish tyranny, believing true independence was finally near. Others worried that American control might simply replace one colonial system with another. The Cuban rebels who had fought for years found themselves excluded from peace negotiations, which deepened concerns about the future. Cuba at that moment was a land wounded by war. Battles had destroyed plantations, burned villages, and disrupted the economy. Many families mourned loved ones lost to violence or disease. Roads and bridges needed repair. Schools, hospitals, and public institutions were in desperate condition. Although Spain was gone, the island faced enormous challenges that required immediate attention. The United States began organizing a temporary military occupation, promising to restore order, rebuild the economy, and prepare Cuba for self-government. American leaders argued that Cuba was not ready for independence yet. Some believed it was necessary to guide the island toward stability. Others saw the occupation as an opportunity to expand American influence in the Caribbean. Cuban nationalists, however, remained determined to claim their own destiny. The removal of Spain marked a turning point in the island's identity. Cuban culture, once shaped by Spanish traditions, began shifting toward new influences. Writers, poets, and political thinkers celebrated the end of colonial rule in their work, expressing pride in Cuban identity and a longing for freedom. The dream of independence had survived decades of repression, and now, with Spain gone, it felt closer than ever. But the end of Spanish rule did not bring immediate peace. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one defined by negotiation, tension, and the struggle for full sovereignty. The Cuban people had pushed out a European empire, only to confront a rising American power. The next years would reveal whether Cuba's long fight for independence would finally succeed, or whether the island would enter yet another era of foreign control. The events of 1898 marked the beginning of modern Cuban history. It was a year of victory, loss, hope, and uncertainty. Spain's departure ended one era, but what came next would shape Cuba for generations. When the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, Cuba suddenly found itself at a historic turning point. Spanish rule had collapsed, and for the first time in centuries, the island was free from European colonial control. But instead of becoming fully independent, Cuba came under the authority of a new foreign power, the United States. The U.S. military quickly moved into the island, not as a temporary guest, but as the new governing force responsible for restoring order and shaping Cuba's future. This marked the beginning of a complex and often controversial occupation that would last until 1902. The American military arrived in a country devastated by years of war. Cuba's economy was shattered, farmlands were burned, sugar mills were destroyed, and livestock populations had fallen drastically. Many towns were depopulated, and thousands of families had been displaced. Disease spread easily due to poor sanitation, overcrowding, and a lack of medical care. Hunger was widespread. The destruction left behind by both Spanish repression and the rebel struggle created a humanitarian crisis that the U.S. now had to confront. The first goal of the U.S. occupation was to restore stability. American soldiers took control of government buildings, ports, and communication lines. They began reorganizing public services and establishing a temporary administration. With Spanish officials gone, there was no functioning Cuban government to take their place. The U.S. military, led by General John Arbrook and later General Leonard Wood, assumed full responsibility for public order. Soldiers patrolled streets, maintained security, and enforced new regulations meant to prevent chaos. One of the most urgent problems the Americans faced was public health. Cuba had long suffered from diseases such as yellow fever, malaria, and smallpox. During the war, overcrowded towns and refugee camps made the situation worse. American medical experts, including Dr. Walter Reed and Dr. Carlos Finley, launched extensive campaigns to clean cities, improve sanitation, eliminate mosquito breeding grounds, and modernize hospitals. These efforts saved thousands of lives and dramatically reduced the spread of diseases that had plagued Cuba for generations. At the same time, the U.S. military government began rebuilding key infrastructure. Roads and bridges were repaired to reconnect communities. Schools reopened, and new textbooks were introduced. Railways were restored to restart the movement of goods and people. Ports were improved to encourage trade. The Americans argued that these projects were necessary to prepare Cuba for self-government and economic stability. Many Cubans appreciated these improvements, while others feared that such investments were designed to increase U.S. control over the island. Economic reform became another major focus. With sugar production nearly destroyed, the U.S. worked to revive plantations and modernize agricultural techniques. American investors arrived, attracted by the island's resources and potential profits. This created jobs and stimulated recovery, but it also raised concerns that foreign companies would dominate Cuba's economy. The balance between rebuilding and exploitation became a continuing point of tension. The U.S. also restructured various branches of public administration. Courts were reopened, new judges were appointed, and laws were revised to align with American legal principles. Police forces were reorganized to ensure order and reduce corruption. Prisons were inspected and regulated. These changes introduced a new model of governance, one based on American systems rather than Spanish colonial traditions or Cuban preferences. Meanwhile, the Cuban people watched closely. They had fought long and hard for independence, and many expected to finally control their own nation. However, the U.S. government insisted that Cuba was not yet ready for self-rule. American leaders argued that the island needed time to recover, and that stable governance had to be established before independence could be granted. While some Cubans agreed, believing reconstruction was necessary, others felt betrayed. They feared the U.S. was replacing Spain as Cuba's new colonial master. Cuban nationalists were especially vocal. Veterans of the Independence War, political activists, and intellectuals demanded that the U.S. honor its promise to support Cuban freedom. Public meetings were held. Newspapers published sharp criticisms, and political organizations pushed for a clear timeline for independence. Though the military government allowed limited expression, tensions grew as Cubans realized that the path to sovereignty might not be as straightforward as they had hoped. Despite this pressure, the U.S. continued to shape Cuba according to its own plans. American officials introduced administrative reforms they believed would modernize the island. They encouraged local elections for municipal positions. though these elections remained under U.S. supervision. Schools emphasized civic education based on American ideals. Public works projects aimed to strengthen Cuba's infrastructure, while guiding it toward an economic model compatible with U.S. interests. By the end of 1899, the occupation had brought noticeable improvements. Streets were cleaner, infectious diseases had decreased, and the economy showed signs of revival. Yet the question of independence remained unresolved. The United States had gained control of the island not as a permanent colony, but as a protector, with the stated goal of preparing Cuba for self-government. However, it became increasingly clear that the U.S. intended to maintain influence, even after withdrawal. As the new century approached, Cuba was caught between recovery and uncertainty. Spanish rule was gone, but sovereignty had not yet been achieved. The island was slowly rebuilding, but its political future remained in the hands of another nation. The American occupation had brought both progress and controversy. It stabilized Cuba, but at the cost of delaying Cubans. The end of Spanish rule had opened the door to freedom. But the arrival of U.S. authority introduced a new chapter, one shaped by reconstruction, tension, and the struggle to define Cuba's future. As the occupation solidified, Cuban leaders prepared for the next phase, the fight to reclaim the independence they had long dreamed of. Now, from a different power, when the United States began its military occupation of Cuba in 1898, it stepped into a nation that was deeply scarred by war, poverty, and political instability. Spanish rule had ended abruptly, leaving behind empty government offices, broken systems, and a population exhausted by years of violence and repression. Into this vacuum came the U.S. military government, tasked with restoring order, rebuilding institutions, and preparing Cuba for a future that was still unclear. The actions taken during this period shaped the direction of the island for decades. From the moment American troops assumed authority, they recognized that Cuba required far more than simple military control. The country needed functioning public services, effective administration, and a complete reorganization of its social and political systems. The U.S. military government, led first by General John R. Brooke and later by General Leonard Wood, began to operate as a temporary government of Cuba, holding powers over taxation, law enforcement, public health, education, and infrastructure. One of the first responsibilities of the U.S. administration was public health, because Cuba was struggling with deadly diseases. Yellow fever, malaria, and smallpox were common, and Spanish policies of forced relocation during the war had worsened the situation. American medical teams launched extensive health campaigns across the island. Streets were cleaned, garbage was collected, and stagnant water was drained to eliminate mosquito breeding grounds. Quarantine stations were built at ports. Medical facilities were expanded and modernized. The work of Dr. Walter Reed and Cuban Dr. Carlos Finley confirmed the role of mosquitoes in spreading yellow fever, leading to groundbreaking public health measures. These efforts dramatically reduced disease and saved countless lives, becoming one of the most successful achievements of the occupation. At the same time, the U.S. military government began rebuilding Cuba's infrastructure. Roads damaged by war were repaired to reconnect rural communities with major cities. Railroads were restored to move sugar, tobacco, and other goods essential to the island's economy. Bridges, ports, and public buildings were rebuilt or improved. Havana received new sewage systems, modern lighting, and updated water distribution networks. These projects boosted the economy and improved daily living conditions, but they also strengthened American strategic and commercial interests on the island. The U.S. also restructured the legal and administrative systems. Spanish colonial laws, many outdated or repressive, were revised or replaced. New courts were established, and American legal principles influenced reforms in civil and criminal justice. Corruption deeply embedded in the old colonial system was targeted aggressively. Police forces were reorganized to operate under stricter regulations and oversight. Though these changes improved public order, they also introduced American-style governance that sometimes clashed with Cuban traditions and expectations. Another major focus was education. The United States saw schooling as essential to shaping the island's future. New school buildings were constructed, and thousands of Cuban teachers were trained in modern teaching methods. American textbooks, emphasizing civic responsibility, hygiene, and democratic values, were introduced. Literacy campaigns expanded access to education in rural areas. While the reforms broadened educational opportunities, many Cubans believed the curriculum reflected U.S. cultural influence more than Cuban identity, creating debates over national heritage and foreign involvement. Economically, The U.S. military government attempted to revive Cuba's agricultural and commercial sectors. Sugar plantations, once the backbone of the economy, needed major rebuilding. American investors were encouraged to enter the market, purchasing land and opening new enterprises. This helped restart production and provided employment, but it also increased American economic dominance. Trade regulations were modified to favor U.S. businesses. Tariffs and import policies strengthened ties between Cuba and American markets. For Cuban nationalists, this raised concerns that the island's economy was becoming dependent on the United States. The U.S. administration also tried to introduce political reforms. Municipal elections were held in some towns, allowing Cubans to vote for mayors and local councils. However, the military government retained overall control, limiting Cuban political power. American officials claimed that Cuba needed gradual political development to avoid instability. Cuban leaders, on the other hand, argued that they had fought for full independence, not supervised autonomy. This tension grew stronger each year. Despite disagreements, the U.S. military government attempted to cooperate with Cuban leaders, especially veterans of the independence movement. Committees were formed to discuss constitutional issues, public policies, and the transition to civil rule. These discussions laid the groundwork for a future Cuban government. But American authorities maintained the final say on major decisions. To many Cubans, the occupation resembled colonialism under a different flag, even as the U.S. insisted its goal was to prepare Cuba for sovereignty. Daily life for ordinary Cubans slowly improved. Crime decreased, public services resumed, and commerce revived. Cities became cleaner, safer, and more organized. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants reopened shops, and schools filled with children who had missed years of learning. Yet beneath this progress lay uncertainty. The Cuban people wanted independence, but the U.S. military government believed that more time was needed before the island could govern itself. General Leonard Wood, who became the most influential figure of the occupation, summarized the American view clearly. Our goal is to make Cuba fit for self-government. But for Cuban nationalists, this goal carried a frustrating implication. Cuba's future was being determined by foreign officials rather than its own people. By 1901, pressure from Cuban leaders and resistance from the population forced the U.S. to accelerate plans for withdrawal. However, when Congress passed the Platt Amendment, it became clear that American control would not end even after the soldiers left. The occupation had rebuilt Cuba, but it had also set the stage for ongoing U.S. influence over the island's politics and security. The role of the U.S. military government was complex. It brought modernization, reform, and stability. But it also limited Cuban sovereignty and created structures that ensured American dominance. The legacy of this occupation shaped Cuba's political path and set up the conflict between Cuban aspirations and U.S. interests conflicts that would echo throughout the island's future history. By the end of 1898, Cuba was a nation deeply wounded by 3 decades of conflict. Years of uprisings, scorched earth tactics, and brutal Spanish repression had left the island physically shattered and emotionally exhausted. Entire towns had been burned, plantations were abandoned, roads had turned to mud and rubble. Thousands of families had lost homes, farms, and livelihoods. When the United States assumed control, it inherited an island where basic survival had become a daily struggle. Rebuilding Cuba was not simply a political challenge, it was a humanitarian emergency. The most urgent task for the U.S. administration was addressing the public health crisis that had devastated the population. During the last years of Spanish rule, the reconcentration policy had forced civilians into overcrowded camps, where hunger and disease swept through families. Malaria, smallpox, and especially yellow fever threatened to destabilize the island even after the war had ended. American doctors, working alongside Cuban physicians, launched an unprecedented public health campaign. Streets were cleaned daily. Garbage disposal systems were reorganized. Mosquito-infested ponds and swamps were drained. Houses and neighborhoods were fumigated. Hospitals were improved and supplied with modern equipment. In Havana, sanitation reforms transformed one of the most disease-ridden cities in the Caribbean into a much safer environment. These efforts nearly eliminated yellow fever within a few years, marking a turning point in Cuba's health history. While public health improvements saved lives, rebuilding infrastructure was essential to restoring normal life. Roads across the island were in terrible condition, having been neglected during decades of war. The U.S. military government directed engineers to repair highways, rebuild bridges, and restore railways that had been destroyed. This work reconnected sugar mills with ports, farmers with markets, and families with distant towns. The reconstruction of Havana Harbor allowed commercial ships to return, reviving trade. New lighthouses, telegraph lines, and postal routes were established to modernize communication across the island. Schools, once closed or neglected, became another priority. Thousands of children had grown up without access to education due to constant warfare. The U.S. administration reopened schools, hired and trained teachers, and built new classrooms throughout rural provinces. Literacy campaigns reached areas that had been isolated for generations. Although American influence in the curriculum was debated, the expansion of education helped cultivate a generation of Cubans who would later lead the island's political and social movements. Reconstruction also required rebuilding the economy, which had collapsed under the weight of war. Sugar, tobacco, rum, and coffee. Cuba's key industries were either destroyed or operating at minimal capacity. The U.S. encouraged repairs to sugar mills, reopened factories, and brought in machinery that had been unavailable during the war. Farmers received seeds, tools, and livestock to restart production. American investors purchased land and opened new businesses, helping inject capital into the economy. This revival created jobs for thousands of unemployed Cubans, though it also increased foreign ownership of Cuban resources, which caused resentment among nationalists who feared economic domination. One of the most visible reconstruction efforts involved the restoration of cities. Habana, Santiago, Matanzas, and other urban centers underwent major improvements. Streets were paved, new lighting systems were installed, parks and plazas were cleaned and restored, buildings damaged by conflict were repaired or rebuilt. Public transportation expanded to help workers travel more efficiently. These changes helped rejuvenate urban life, bringing a sense of normalcy after years of destruction. Rural areas, however, faced a slower recovery. Many farmers returned to find their land ruined, their homes burned, and their livestock gone. The U.S. military government organized relief centers that offered food, clothing, and basic supplies. Agricultural schools were created to teach modern farming techniques. Irrigation systems were repaired to increase crop yields. Still, the path to recovery was uneven. Wealthier regions recovered quickly, while poorer communities struggled for years. Cuban society also had to rebuild itself emotionally. The trauma of war left deep scars. Families mourned lost members, veterans struggled with injuries and poverty, and communities tried to restore relationships torn apart by conflict. Churches, mutual aid associations, and civic groups played an important role in helping people rebuild their lives. Cultural pride resurfaced as Cubans expressed their identity through music, poetry, and political activism. Rebuilding was not only about structures, it was about healing a nation's spirit. As Reconstruction progressed, the relationship between Cubans and the U.S. military government became increasingly complex. Many Cubans appreciated the improvements in health, sanitation, and infrastructure. They recognized that the occupation brought order after years of chaos. But the longer the U.S. remained in control, the more questions arose about the nature of this rebuilding. Was it truly preparing Cuba for independence, or was it shaping the island to serve American interests? Rebuilt roads made commerce easier, but also strengthened U.S. military mobility. Improved ports boosted trade, but also increased American economic influence. Schools expanded education, yet some felt they promoted foreign values. Despite these concerns, it was undeniable that Cuba in 1901 looked very different from Cuba in 1898. The island had cleaner cities, functioning schools, safer hospitals, and a recovering economy. Roads and railways connected the nation again. People returned to work. Children returned to classrooms. Life began to move forward, but the most significant question remained unresolved. Once Cuba stood on its feet again, who would control its future? Would the U.S. step aside and allow true independence, or would Reconstruction lay the foundation for continued American involvement? The next phase of history would show that rebuilding was only the beginning of a struggle over sovereignty. Cuba was rising from the ruins, but the conflict between its desire for independence and America's growing influence was becoming impossible to ignore. The island had been rebuilt physically, but its political destiny was still uncertain. As the U.S. military occupation of Cuba continued into the early 1900s, the island entered a phase of deep economic and social restructuring. The war against Spain had left the Cuban economy in ruins, farms destroyed, factories silent, and commerce frozen. The United States believed that rebuilding Cuba required more than repairing roads and hospitals. It needed a new economic foundation, new institutions, and new social programs capable of transforming daily life on the island. These reforms shaped Cuban society in ways that would last long after the occupation ended. One of the most significant economic reforms involved reviving agriculture, especially the sugar industry. Sugar had long been Cuba's main export, but war had nearly wiped out production. Fields were burned, mills were abandoned, and thousands of workers had fled or died during the conflict. The U.S. government encouraged planters to return to their land, offering loans, modern farming tools, and access to American markets. New machinery arrived from the United States, boosting production and helping plantations reopen. American investors also purchased large areas of land, rebuilding mills and creating powerful sugar companies. This revitalized the economy and provided thousands of jobs, but it also increased foreign control over Cuban resources. Along with agriculture, the U.S. worked to stimulate industrial growth. Factories producing cigarettes, textiles, rum, and processed foods reopened with American assistance. The sugar mills that returned to operation required railroads, warehouses, and labor, creating a wave of new employment opportunities. However, this rapid growth also led to economic dependence. Many of the largest enterprises were owned or managed by Americans, sparking debates about whether Cuba was rebuilding or being economically absorbed by its northern neighbor. Trade policies under the occupation further strengthened U.S. influence. New tariff agreements created favorable conditions for American goods to enter the Cuban market. Companies exported everything from farm equipment to clothing to household goods, while Cuba exported sugar and tobacco, mainly to the United States. This close economic relationship helped stabilize recovery, but limited Cuba's ability to develop independently. Some Cuban nationalists warned that although Spain was gone, the island risked falling under a different kind of foreign control, economic rather than political. Social reforms soon followed. The U.S. military government believed that rebuilding society required improving the conditions of ordinary people. One of the first steps was expanding public education. Schools were repaired or constructed, and teacher training programs were established throughout the island. Attendance increased dramatically. Students learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic hygiene. American educators introduced new textbooks and teaching methods, emphasizing civic values and modern learning. Many Cubans welcomed these changes, seeing education as essential for national progress. Others feared that the curriculum carried too much American influence and did not reflect Cuban history or culture. Health reforms also reshaped society. After major victories over yellow fever and other diseases, the U.S. expanded efforts to improve overall public health. Vaccination programs reached remote communities, clean water systems were installed, and new clinics opened in rural areas. Mortality rates dropped, and life expectancy slowly increased. These improvements transformed everyday life and created a healthier population ready to participate in rebuilding the island. Another major area of reform involved labor and social welfare. The war had left thousands of Cuban workers unemployed or underpaid. The U.S. administration introduced labor regulations aimed at reducing corruption and improving working conditions. Public works projects hired thousands of workers to rebuild roads, restore bridges, and construct public buildings. Wages, though modest, provided a stable income during a period of uncertainty. Charitable organizations, including both American and Cuban groups, offered assistance to widows, orphans, and families struggling to recover. Urban life changed as well. In Havana, sanitation improvements made the city cleaner than it had been in decades. Trash collection became more regular. Markets reopened with improved hygiene. Public transportation expanded. Parks and public spaces were renovated to serve as centers for community gatherings. These changes made cities more livable and helped restore a sense of normalcy. Still, even as reforms improved daily life, tensions grew beneath the surface. Many Cubans appreciated better schools, cleaner cities, and revived industries, but they questioned the motives behind these changes. Was the United States truly preparing Cuba for independence, or was it shaping the island to fit American economic and political interests? The growing presence of American companies, the dependence on U.S. trade, and the influence of American cultural values sparked debates across society. Political leaders and veterans of the independence movement expressed frustration that Cuba had not yet gained full sovereignty. They argued that true independence required not only political freedom, but also economic control. Without it, they feared Cuba would remain vulnerable to foreign intervention. These concerns grew stronger as the occupation continued, setting the stage for future conflicts. By 1901, the economic and social reforms introduced by the U.S. military had transformed Cuba. The island was cleaner, healthier, and more economically active than it had been in years. Schools, hospitals, farms, and factories were functioning again. But along with progress came a new reality. Cuba was now deeply connected to the United States. The prosperity that returned to the island depended heavily on American support and investment. Rebuilding had given Cuba the tools for a stronger society, but it had also created new tensions about sovereignty and identity. The next stage in Cuba's struggle would reveal whether the island could take this progress and use it to build its own future, or whether U.S. influence would continue to shape its destiny. As the U.S. military occupation continued into the early 1900s, the Cuban people grew increasingly restless. They had fought long and hard to end Spanish rule, and many believed independence was their natural reward. Yet by 1900, Cuba was still governed, not by its own leaders, but by American military officials. Streets were cleaner, schools had reopened, and the economy was recovering. But for many Cubans, these improvements meant little without true sovereignty. Beneath the surface of progress, a powerful political force was growing: the rise of Cuban nationalism. Veterans of the Independence War were among the most vocal. These men had risked everything for freedom, losing family members, land and health in the struggle against Spain. Many had taken up arms as teenagers and spent years fighting in the countryside. To them, the idea that Cuba needed preparation before ruling itself felt insulting. They argued that no foreign power, even one promising to help, should decide the destiny of the Cuban nation. Public speeches, gatherings, and political writings began spreading the message that the time for independence had arrived not years later, but now. Cuban intellectuals also played a crucial role. Newspapers in Havana, Santiago, and other cities published passionate articles demanding a timeline for American withdrawal. Writers and poets emphasized the island's cultural identity, reminding citizens that Cuba had its own heroes, values, and traditions. They feared that American influence, whether through education, business, or laws, might overshadow or even replace Cuban identity. Their words resonated deeply with a population eager to reclaim its national pride. As the nationalist movement grew stronger, public pressure intensified. Crowds gathered in plazas to hear speeches advocating freedom. Political clubs formed to coordinate demands. Former rebel leaders organized meetings to discuss Cuba's future government. These groups insisted that Cuba was ready to stand on its own, pointing to the island's long history of resistance and sacrifice. The idea that American officials could determine Cuba's readiness became a source of frustration, especially among those who viewed the U.S. presence as a new form of foreign control. The American military government, however, believed that Cuba still lacked the political stability and administrative systems necessary for independence. They pointed to the destruction left by war and argued that immediate withdrawal could lead to chaos. Although they permitted public gatherings and political discussion, they continued to control major decisions. Cuban leaders were allowed to participate in some areas of governance, but only under American supervision. This created a delicate balance. Cuban voices were being heard, yet they did not hold real authority. Tensions grew as nationalists realized that reforms were happening, but sovereignty was not. Roads were rebuilt, but the power to control them remained foreign. Schools expanded, but the curriculum reflected American ideas. The economy improved, but large sectors were owned by American investors. Each advancement was a reminder that Cuba was still not free. For many nationalists, true independence meant more than repaired buildings. It meant the ability to make decisions without outside approval. The strongest demands came during discussions about Cuba's future constitution. Cuban delegates wanted a document that granted full sovereignty, complete control of foreign policy, and the ability to make independent decisions. They expected the United States to respect the spirit of the war for independence. But behind the scenes, American lawmakers debated how much control they were willing to relinquish. The U.S. government wanted to ensure political stability, protect American investments, and maintain influence in the Caribbean. These conflicting priorities created a widening gap between Cuban expectations and American intentions. Public frustration reached new levels as rumors spread that the United States might remain in Cuba indefinitely. Nationalist groups organized rallies, circulated petitions, and flooded newspapers with arguments in favor of immediate independence. Veterans delivered emotional speeches about fallen comrades who had died believing they were fighting for a free Cuba. Everyday citizens, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and laborers joined the movement, strengthening the demand for sovereignty. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, the U.S. made it clear that independence would come only on terms that protected American interests. This realization shocked many Cubans, who had viewed the United States as a liberating ally. The mood shifted from gratitude to suspicion. Nationalists warned that Cuba must stand firm or risk trading one colonial master for another. The island was entering a new phase of its struggle, no longer fighting Spain, but negotiating with a powerful new neighbor. By 1901, it was clear that Cuban nationalism could not be ignored. The U.S. military government allowed Cuban delegates to draft a constitution, marking a major step towards self-rule. But soon, the United States would introduce a condition that changed everything: the Platt Amendment, a law that would severely limit Cuban sovereignty. Cuban nationalists had pushed the island toward independence, but the battle was far from over. Their next challenge would be confronting the terms imposed by the United States, a struggle that would define Cuba's relationship with its northern neighbor for decades. By 1901, Cuban hopes for full independence were rising. The U.S. military government had allowed Cuban leaders to gather and draft a new constitution, giving the island its first real opportunity to shape its own political future. Cuban delegates met with determination, eager to build a free republic that honored the sacrifices of the independence struggle. Their draft reflected the ideals they had fought for: complete sovereignty, democratic institutions, and the promise of a nation finally able to govern itself. But just as the dream seemed within reach, the United States introduced a condition that would change everything: the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was not written by Cubans. It was drafted in Washington, passed by the U.S. Congress, and then delivered to Cuba as a requirement for ending the military occupation. In simple terms, it stated, Cuba could become a republic, but only if it accepted new rules that gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. The U.S. presented it as necessary for stability and mutual protection. To many Cubans, however, it felt like a new form of controlled colonialism disguised as partnership. The amendment contained several key provisions, each one limiting Cuban autonomy. First, it allowed the United States to intervene in Cuba whenever it believed Cuban independence or public order was threatened. This meant that even after independence, American troops could return at any time, for reasons defined solely by the U.S. government. Second, Cuba could not sign treaties with foreign powers that might weaken its independence or allow another country to gain influence on the island, effectively giving the United States dominance in Cuban foreign policy. Third, Cuba had to lease or sell land to the United States for naval bases, leading to the establishment of the naval station at Guantánamo Bay, which remains under U.S. control even today. When Cuban delegates received the Platt Amendment, shock and anger spread quickly. For months, they had worked to write a constitution that reflected the values of their independence movement. Now, they were being told that their hard-won sovereignty would exist only under American permission. Many argued fiercely against accepting the amendment. Veterans of the wars for independence declared that they had not fought Spain for 3 decades, only to surrender their dignity to another foreign power. Public demonstrations and political speeches expressed frustration, disappointment, and a sense of betrayal. However, the United States made its position clear. Cuba would not receive full independence unless it accepted the Platt Amendment. With American troops still on the island and the economy heavily dependent on U.S. support, Cuban delegates realized they had little choice. Rejecting the amendment could prolong the occupation indefinitely. Accepting it would allow Cuba to become a republic, though one with significant restrictions. After intense debate, the Cuban Constitutional Convention reluctantly voted to incorporate the Platt Amendment into the new constitution. The decision was painful. Many delegates voted yes only because they feared the consequences of saying no. Others voted against it, but were outnumbered. Across the island, newspapers described the vote as a humiliating compromise. Yet, despite the frustration, many Cubans tried to focus on the positive. Independence, even limited, was finally coming. Within months, the U.S. military government prepared to end its direct control and hand over authority to a Cuban administration. The imposition of the Platt Amendment shaped Cuba's destiny for decades. It ensured that the United States would remain the dominant force in Cuban politics. Any crisis, political instability, economic downturn, or social unrest could invite American intervention. This arrangement created a power imbalance that undermined Cuban sovereignty and fueled resentment among nationalists. To many Cubans, the amendment symbolized the idea that their independence was incomplete. The establishment of Guantanamo Bay as a U.S. naval base was one of the most lasting consequences. The location gave the United States military a strategic foothold in the Caribbean, but it also represented a permanent reminder of U.S. leverage over Cuba. The base became both a symbol of American strength and a source of Cuban frustration. Still, even under the weight of these conditions, the Cuban people continued preparing for the moment they would finally govern themselves. Political parties formed, campaigns began, and the first Cuban presidential election approached. Although the Platt Amendment limited the new republic's freedom, it did not erase the hope for a future in which Cuba might one day amend or abolish the restrictions imposed by a foreign power. The passage of the Platt Amendment marked a turning point, a moment when Cuba realized that independence was no longer only a struggle against Spain, but also a negotiation with the United States. It revealed the complexity of international relations, where victory in war did not always guarantee freedom, and where new powers could shape the destiny of nations emerging from conflict. Cuba was moving toward independence, but not the independence it had dreamed of. The next stage of its history would unfold under the shadow of the Platt Amendment, as the island tried to build a republic while navigating the influence of a powerful neighbor. On May 20, 1902, Cuba woke up to a new dawn, the official birth of the Republic of Cuba. After centuries under Spanish rule and nearly 4 years of U.S. military occupation, the island finally saw the transfer of authority to a Cuban government. Flags rose above Havana's buildings, bands played patriotic music, and crowds filled the streets with hope, pride, and cautious optimism. Independence had arrived, but it came with conditions that would shape the young republic from its first day. The ceremony marking the end of U.S. occupation took place at the presidential palace in Havana. General Leonard Wood, the last American military governor, formally handed power to Cuba's first elected president, Tomás Estrada Palma. Estrada Palma, a respected veteran of the independence movement, represented stability and moderation. He promised to lead Cuba toward prosperity, unity, and responsible governance. His election symbolized the transition from foreign control to Cuban leadership, though everyone understood that independence was not complete. As Estrada Palma took office, he faced both opportunity and difficulty. Cuba was a damaged country, still recovering from war. Infrastructure improvements from the U.S. occupation had helped, but much work remained. Roads needed maintenance, railroads needed expansion, and cities still lacked modern sewage systems and water networks. Schools required more resources, and the health system needed ongoing investment to prevent disease outbreaks. The new government had to build on the progress made while charting its own course. Economically, Cuba entered independence with renewed activity but significant dependency. Sugar exports had revived, thanks to American investment, but this tied the island closely to the U.S. market. Tobacco production also increased, yet many of the largest factories were owned by foreign companies. For Cuban workers and small farmers, opportunities grew, but so did concerns about foreign influence. Estrada Palma's administration sought to strengthen financial stability, attract investment, and encourage domestic production, though these efforts often kept Cuba within the orbit of American economic interests. Politically, the new republic began with a constitution that included the Platt Amendment, limiting Cuba's autonomy. Although Cubans elected their own president, Congress, and officials, the U.S. retained the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. This reality was impossible to ignore. Many citizens celebrated independence with pride, yet the presence of U.S. power lingered like a shadow. The requirement to lease land for American naval bases, most notably Guantanamo Bay, served as a constant reminder that Cuba's sovereignty was not absolute. Nevertheless, the establishment of the republic inspired hope. Public celebrations took place across the island. Fireworks lit up Havana's Malecon. Families waved Cuban flags from balconies and rooftops. Former rebels, teachers, farmers, and merchants felt a shared sense of achievement. Newspapers declared the moment a historic victory, a culmination of decades of struggle. Even those who were skeptical about the Platt Amendment acknowledged that Cuban leadership, however limited, was better than foreign rule. Under Estrada Palma, the government emphasized stability. He expanded public education, improved communication networks, and promoted civic institutions. His administration sought peaceful relations with the United States, while also trying to strengthen Cuba's independent identity. Local governments gained authority, police forces were reorganized, and public works projects continued to modernize the island. These early years established the basic structure of the Cuban state, but challenges quickly emerged. Political divisions surfaced between supporters of Estrada Palma and opposition. Groups who believed his government favored U.S. interests too strongly. Nationalists argued that the spirit of independence was incomplete as long as the Platt Amendment existed. Veterans demanded more recognition and support. Rural communities complained about uneven development. These tensions hinted that the young republic's stability might be fragile. Socially, the meaning of independence differed across classes and regions. Urban elites benefited most from economic growth and foreign investment. In contrast, small farmers and laborers still struggled with low wages, uncertain land ownership, and limited opportunities. Education expanded, but access varied between cities and rural provinces. The republic had achieved political independence on paper, yet inequality remained a significant barrier to national unity. Despite these challenges, Cuba's entry into the international community as a sovereign state marked a major achievement. The island established diplomatic relations, encouraged trade partnerships, and participated in regional affairs. Cuban leaders sought to build a national identity rooted in resilience, cultural pride, and the legacy of José Martí and the independence movement. The symbolism of raising the Cuban flag over Havana for the first time as a republic carried emotional power, even if political limitations persisted. By the end of 1902, the Cuban Republic stood at a crossroads. The island had taken control of its government, but its autonomy was restricted. The U.S. military had departed, yet American influence remained strong through economic ties and the Platt Amendment. The Cuban people had achieved the independence they had long dreamed of, but they also understood that their nation's future would require ongoing struggle, negotiation, and determination. The establishment of the republic was both an ending and a beginning, the end of centuries of colonial domination, and the beginning of a new era marked by hope, complexity, and the unfinished quest for full sovereignty. Cuba had entered the world as a free nation, but its next chapters would reveal how difficult true independence could be. After the Cuban Republic was established in 1902, the island entered a new era, one that was independent in appearance, but deeply shaped by the continuing influence of the United States. Though American troops had withdrawn, the Platt Amendment remained in force, creating a political and economic relationship that allowed the U.S. to intervene whenever it believed its interests or Cuba's stability were at risk. For many Cubans, independence was real, but incomplete. For the United States, Cuba had become part of its growing sphere of influence in the Caribbean. The most visible symbol of US power was Guantanamo Bay, the naval base secured through a lease agreement under the Platt Amendment. This base gave the United States a permanent military presence on Cuban soil. It served as a strategic foothold for American naval operations in the region and as a constant reminder that Cuban sovereignty had limits. The base was not merely a military installation, it represented the reality that the United States intended to remain deeply involved in Cuba's affairs. Economically, U.S. influence grew rapidly. American companies invested heavily in sugar plantations, railroads, mines, and utilities. Within a few years, U.S. businesses controlled large portions of the sugar industry, which was the backbone of Cuba's economy. This brought jobs, wages, and modernization. But it also concentrated wealth and power in foreign hands. Many Cuban workers earned modest incomes, while American investors earned massive profits. For Cuban nationalists and intellectuals, this imbalance raised fears that economic dependence could become as dangerous as political control. Trade agreements further reinforced this dependence. Cuban sugar flowed north to the United States, and in return, American goods flooded Cuban markets. Everyday items, clothing, machinery, tools, and consumer products were imported from the U.S. This strengthened the island's economy, but limited its ability to develop local industries. Cuba became increasingly tied to global markets, controlled by its northern neighbor. Stability grew, but so did vulnerability. Politically, the Platt Amendment gave the United States the right to intervene if it believed Cuban independence was threatened. This clause soon became a source of tension. In 1906, just 4 years after independence, political disputes and rebellions created instability in the Cuban government. The United States declared that public order was collapsing and invoked its right to intervene. American troops returned to Cuba, beginning the second U.S. occupation, which lasted until 1909. For many Cubans, this event confirmed their worst fears. Independence existed only as long as the United States allowed it. Even after American troops withdrew again, the message was clear: U.S. influence could be reasserted at any time. Cuban presidents understood that maintaining good relations with Washington was essential to political survival. This reality shaped elections, government decisions, and economic policies. While Cuba had its own leaders and laws, much of its governance was carried out with American expectations in mind. Everyday life reflected this growing influence. American culture spread across the island through movies, music, fashion, and sports. Baseball became a national passion. Havana welcomed American tourists, especially during winter seasons. Luxurious hotels, casinos, and theaters catered to us visitors. While this brought revenue, it also created social tensions. Some Cubans embraced American culture enthusiastically, while others viewed it as another form of foreign intrusion. Education also reflected outside influence. Schools expanded, but many textbooks and teaching methods were adopted from the United States. Although literacy increased and educational opportunities improved, critics argued that Cuba's cultural identity risked being overshadowed by foreign ideas. The challenge for many Cuban leaders was to modernize the country without losing the cultural roots that defined the island. Despite these challenges, Cuban nationalism did not disappear, it grew stronger. Writers, political thinkers, and activists argued that true independence required removing or limiting the Platt Amendment. Newspapers published bold editorials, public demonstrations called for greater sovereignty, and intellectual leaders redefined Cuban identity through literature and journalism. The island's youth, educated in the years after independence, became increasingly vocal in defending national pride. Throughout the early 1900s, Cuba walked a delicate line between progress and dependence. The republic was stable enough to function, but not sovereign enough to control its own destiny. Economic growth continued, yet it relied heavily on American markets and capital. Political life developed, but under the shadow of potential U.S. intervention. Independence had been achieved, but its meaning remained contested. The long-term impact of these years shaped the course of Cuban history. U.S. influence brought modernization, public health improvements, and economic expansion. But it also created resentment, inequality, and a sense among many Cubans that their revolution had not fully succeeded. These frustrations would simmer for decades, ultimately contributing to the overthrow of the old system and the rise of new revolutionary movements in the mid-20th century. Cuba's early republic was a nation pulled in two directions: toward modernization under American guidance, and toward true sovereignty driven by its own people. The struggle between these forces defined the island's path and set the stage for the conflicts that would reshape Cuba in the years to come. As the early decades of the Cuban Republic unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the legacy of the U.S. occupation from 1898 to 1902 had shaped the island more deeply than many Cubans had imagined. The physical scars of war slowly healed, roads were rebuilt, schools reopened, and the economy revived. Yet the political and social consequences of U.S. involvement would echo across the 20th century. The occupation had given Cuba stability, health reforms, and economic growth, but it had also left behind unresolved tensions about sovereignty, national identity, and foreign influence. The Platt Amendment remained at the center of these tensions. Though Cuba functioned as an independent republic, this amendment allowed the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it judged that order or independence was threatened. This clause overshadowed the island's political life like a constant reminder that true sovereignty had not been achieved. Every presidential administration was aware that Washington's approval mattered as much, sometimes more, than domestic support. As a result, Cuban leaders often governed with caution, balancing national aspirations with the realities of U.S. expectations. Economically, the occupation had laid the foundation for a Cuba deeply tied to American markets. The sugar industry became increasingly dominated by foreign ownership, with U.S. companies purchasing plantations, refineries, and railroads. This investment brought jobs in modernization, but it also limited Cuba's ability to diversify its economy. American businesses controlled utilities, mining, and banking as well, creating a system where economic success was largely dependent on decisions made outside the island. To many Cubans, this dependence felt like a new form of colonialism, one based not on armies, but on money. Socially, the influence of the United States reshaped Cuban culture. American fashions, movies, and music spread throughout Havana and other major cities. Baseball became a national passion. Tourism grew rapidly, bringing wealth but also creating spaces where American visitors wielded considerable influence. As the island modernized, some sectors of society embraced these changes, seeing them as signs of progress. Others viewed them with suspicion, worried that Cuban traditions were being overshadowed or erased. This cultural tension became part of a broader debate about what it meant to be Cuban in a world increasingly shaped by foreign power. Politically, the consequences of US involvement became visible in moments of crisis. The second U.S. occupation in 1906 demonstrated how quickly the United States was willing to enforce order under the terms of the Platt Amendment. Even after the withdrawal of troops in 1909, the message was unmistakable. Cuba was independent, but not fully free. This created resentment among nationalists who believed the independence movement had been incomplete. Over time, political factions emerged, those who favored close ties with the United States and those who pushed for greater autonomy or even the complete removal of American influence. This struggle over sovereignty influenced every major political event in Cuba during the first half of the 20th century. Elections, rebellions, constitutional reforms, and public debates all revolved around one question: how much control should the United States have over Cuba? Some leaders tried to navigate this relationship peacefully, seeking cooperation and gradual reform. Others saw confrontation as the only path to true independence. This conflict between moderation and resistance contributed to political instability, corruption, and public disillusionment. The Platt Amendment was eventually repealed in 1934, ending the formal right of U.S. intervention. Its removal was celebrated across the island, as Cubans finally gained a constitution free from foreign-imposed conditions. Yet even after the amendment disappeared, the influence of decades of intervention could not be erased overnight. The economic dominance of American capital, the cultural presence of U.S. society, and the political patterns established during the occupation continued shaping Cuba's internal dynamics. By the mid-20th century, these tensions reached a breaking point. Many Cubans felt that their country had become trapped between foreign influence and domestic inequality. Economic dependence, political instability, and frustration over corruption fueled a desire for change. These pressures contributed to the rise of revolutionary movements that challenged the old system and sought to redefine Cuba's future. The echoes of the U.S. occupation were present in every protest, every political speech, and every attempt to rebuild national identity. Looking back, the U.S. occupation left a complex legacy. On one hand, it brought public health improvements, infrastructure development, and economic recovery that helped Cuba rise from the devastation of war. On the other hand, it imposed political limitations and economic dependencies that shaped the island's struggles for decades. It created a relationship defined by both cooperation and tension, partnership and imbalance, progress and resentment. The story of Cuba between 1898 and 1902 is not just a chapter of military occupation. It is the beginning of a long and complicated relationship between two nations separated by geography but linked by history. It reveals how foreign power can rebuild a country while also binding it in new ways. It shows how independence can be celebrated yet constrained. And it demonstrates that the legacy of an occupation does not end when the last soldier leaves it, continues in the political, economic, and cultural choices of the generations that follow. Cuba's journey after the U.S. occupation was shaped by this mixture of progress and conflict. The island moved forward, rebuilt, and redefined itself again and again. But the questions raised during this early period about sovereignty, identity, and the balance of power would continue influencing Cuba long into the modern era. This is the lasting impact of the U.S. occupation, a legacy that helped build the nation, yet also sparked the struggles that would define its future.